Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Sakis Barmpalexis. I have a PhD in Ethnology from the University of Aberdeen, and currently I am an honorary research fellow for the Elphinstone Institute at the University of Aberdeen, and also a postdoctoral researcher for the National Kapodistrian University of Athens. So tonight's talk is going to be about Celtic shamanism and whether it is a historically accurate term. So, in late March 2014, while researching my master's dissertation on neo-paganism in Scotland, I met an eccentric-looking, tall, well-built, wizard-like figure with long grey hair, a thick beard, and vibrant hippie clothes named Terry Mace. We're both at the Holistic Ways Festival, a traveling holistic health and spirituality festival that visits Aberdeen every March and October. Mace introduced himself as a contemporary shaman and kindly agreed to talk to me about paganism and shamanism, but on condition that I first experienced his work. He invited me, along with others, to his house in Callan, Moray, over a weekend in April 2014 for a 3-day gathering of rituals and ceremonies. It turned out to be one of the most fascinating experiences in my life. It was 3 days of rituals, of exorcism, shape-shifting, fortune-telling, and redemption amidst violent thunderstorms. This introduction to shamanism, healing practices, paved the way to more extensive research of the phenomenon in northeast Scotland. During the course of 6 years, lasting until early 2020, I was fortunate to interview, record, and participate in rituals alongside 2 more such individuals, Andrew Stead and Norman Duncan. These individuals belong to the recent emergent phenomenon of the so-called neo-shaman. These individuals, they offer syncretic practices, mixing imported from elsewhere shamanistic techniques and worldviews, after their creative engagements alongside experienced local healers with Western concepts, ideas, and reinventions or reconstructions of past traditions, and they recontextualized everything according to what is relevant to their land and era. My ethnographic involvement with the 3 practitioners and their communities shaped the 3 key doctoral research questions. How do the life journeys, training, work, and lives of the 3 healers compare with those that are assigned to the cross-cultural shamanic healer? Moreover, how are their practices influenced and shaped by the postmodern landscape in contemporary spirituality? And finally, are these healers part of a historically recorded Scottish or Celtic shamanism that evolved throughout time, or merely emerging phenomena based on individualized practices coexisting in the same geographical region? This last question is the topic of our discussion tonight, and especially the part, as the title suggests, of Celtic shamanism. Did it exist, and if yes, how did it look like? Moreover, what is considered Celtic and what is considered shamanic, shamanistic, or shamanism? And finally, how do the 2 terms shape the life and work of contemporary healers in Scotland? We'll start by looking at shamanism first. The consensus for the origins of the term shaman is that it derives from the Northern Asian Tungus-speaking Evenki people. You see in the map, it's the light blue region in Siberia and Mongolia, who used the word shaman, meaning someone who is excited, moved, or raised, to refer to their local practitioners. The word was adopted by Russians coming in contact with these peoples. It was first introduced to European intellectual circles in the late 17th century by a Dutch traveler named Nicolaas Witsen. Witsen described the shaman as humans dressed in animal skins and headdresses made of antlers, beating drums while performing amidst their community settings. These depictions of otherness and exoticness fascinated European scholars and explorers who embarked on expeditions to discover similar figures elsewhere. The first ethnographic accounts of practices similar to the Tungusic shaman started being published during the 19th century. Soon, the anglicized term shaman, as generated from the German translation of the term, became central in the European academic circles and was gradually applied to all similar practices cross-culturally. There are 4 identical features found in the cross-cultural shaman. They all have the ability to go into an altered state of consciousness or trance state in order to gain access to a culture-defined spiritual world and receive knowledge from spirits to help others. Their main function is that of the healer. They receive year-long training before returning to their communities, and finally, they do all this in the context of a ritual. Features that are also to be found in the life journey of the 3 individuals of the research. Taking into consideration all the above, my definition of shamanism for my research went as following: a phenomenon based on regional representations of similar phenomena across the world, whose core feature is the presence of a local spiritual practitioner, the shaman, with special techniques and functions. However, the geographic expansion of the term to almost everywhere in the world made the phenomenon feel a bit abstract. The main issue was, and still is, that locally structured traditions were all blended together under a single term. As anthropologist Michael Winkelmann points out, the differences and diversities could be traced with respect to the type of societies in which they were found, in terms of their training, the nature of the powers, the characteristics of their altered state of consciousness, the types of healing that they do, and the relationships to social power institutions. In 1987, Winkelmann and Douglas White, using the standard cross-cultural sample as created by Murdoch and White in 1969, examined the ethnographic data they gathered for more than 100 magico-religious practitioners from 45 different societies. These practitioners were assessed according to their unique traits, were compared to each other, and finally were divided into 4 types according to the distinct features they possessed. The 4 types, according to Winkelmann and White, were members of the shaman complex, priests, mediums, seers, and diviners, and finally malevolent witches and sorcerers. The first group was further subcategorized. They called all practitioners shamanistic healers and divided them into 3 subclasses: the shamans, the shaman healers, and the healers. They suggested that what they all had in common was the utilization of the trance state for communicating with the spirit world on behalf of the community, mainly for healing or divination purposes. However, what distinguishes the shaman from the other 2 types, according to the scheme, is the fact that the shaman is mainly found in hunter-gatherer and fishing communities, and in slightly more complex nomadic, horticultural and pastoral societies with little political integration and the absence of social classes. Similarly, there have been also other scholarly attempts to address and underline the plurality and locality of alike phenomena from across the world. Many, for example, suggested that we should rather speak of shamanisms in plural instead of single shamanism. However, despite these rather significant efforts to emphasize multitude and diversity, the term shamanism was already academically established and eventually applied for the practices of communities in the Arctic and subarctic North America, Central and South America, Mongolia, Tibet, Central Asia, Nepal, China, Korea, India, and Indonesia, which are considered to be the core regions of the phenomenon, while there has been a debate over whether the term should be applied also for Africa, First Nation and Native American people, the Pacific Islanders, the Australian Aboriginals, and the Northern European communities of the Scandinavian Sami and pre-Christian Celtic Britain. Which brings us to the other part of tonight's discussion. What is Celtic? Let's examine here historically, conceptually, and academically the issues that have been raised in regards to all things Celtic. Celtic is a term applied to describe a geographically diverse group of pre-Christian European peoples found in France, northwestern Spain, and the British Isles. The main issue with the Celts has always been the fact that the transmission of their traditions and practices was only passed orally. This has raised many debates within academia, initially regarding their origins. Did they appear in the Bronze Era in the north of Alps region of Unfeld-Hallstatt, and then due to conflicts had to travel westwards as most 20th century theories suggest? Or has the Celtic epicenter has always been Gaul, where modern France is, as more recent Celticists like Sims Williams in 2020 theorize, backed up by ancient Greek and Roman historiography? Julius Caesar, whose memoirs are considered one of the most important pieces of evidence regarding the Celts, mentions that the occupied Gauls refer to themselves as Celts or Celti. The Gauls, he also points out, shared many similarities in their lifestyles, beliefs, and practices with their neighbors in the British Isles. Therefore, should they have been Celts as well? And if yes, what were their similarities? Historical theologists Oliver Davies and Thomas O'Loughlin suggest that what made the Celts culturally distinct was the fact that they were locally restricted, they leaned exclusively on oral transmission, and they had a strong tradition of poetry, mythology, and imagery. These features are also verified in Caesar's accounts. There have, however, been academic voices that promoted a different viewpoint. For example, British archaeologist Simon James wrote in 1998 that recent archaeological findings indicate that the Iron Age British peoples were actually a mosaic of different cultures with distinct traditions, while historian Ronald Hatton adds that most of Caesar's accounts were based on hearsay. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the eventual emergence of Christianity, the alleged Celtic tribes became even more restricted geographically, while the use of their local idioms and customs was pushed further in the margins. Despite the historical ambiguity of the Celts, an early modern revival of Celticism emerged in Britain, Ireland, France, and also overseas during the 18th century. Joep Lersen defines Celticism as not the study of the Celts and their history, but rather the study of the reputation and of the meanings and connotation ascribed to the term Celtic. To the extent that Celtic is an idea with a wide and variable application, Celticism becomes a complex and significant issue in the European history of ideas, the history of what people wanted the term to mean. Inspired by the notion of Welsh scholar Anne Lloyd in 1707 that the ancient and modern languages of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany all belonged to the same linguistic family, the 18th century revivalists shared the idea of a united Celtic culture as a distinct ethnic group with commonality in custom and belief. Since the 19th century, Celtic identity and spirituality have become popular in pagan religiosity. Marion Bowman argues that the romantic ideas of a unified Celtic past paved the way for the idea of a Celtic spirit as found within contemporary spiritualities, even among people with no direct linkage with the Celtic ethnic roots. Within the various contemporary Celtic spiritual movements, one can trace attempts, both individual and communal, to recontextualize alleged past traditions, while highly important are also the ideas of self-identity, discovery of roots, and the significance of ancient sites. Contemporary Celtic spirituality movements have been, however, criticized by scholars for a number of reasons. They are accused, for instance, of owing more to New Age than to archaeological or historical evidence, of romanticizing Celtic traditions, and of depicting the Celt as a noble savage, marginal figure, uncorrupted by society and power. Malcolm Chapman summarized this phenomenon. Romanticism created the fringe Celtic minorities as figures of wish fulfillment, of opposition to the prevailing philosophy and actuality of industrializing England. The Celt was a magical figure, a bard, a warrior, and an enchanter beyond the reach of this world, and an object of love and yearning for those doomed to wander among material things in the cold light of reason. However, other scholars, such as Alexandra Bergholm, add another dimension to the discussion, suggesting that these modern expressions of Celticity, rather than being condemned as inauthentic, idealized, or fictitious efforts, actually deserve attention alongside the more traditional topics of Celtic scholarship. And also that the romanticization of the Celts was not an exclusivity of the pagan movement traditions, but can be found among scholars as well. For instance, archaeologist and Celtic scholar Anne Ross argued that although the Celtic people did not share a common central religious system, the rituals and ceremonies were almost identical, while the importance of the natural and supernatural was so integral to their belief systems that it became the basic layer of their spirituality. Ross actually concluded that all this indicate a basic religious homogeneity, which is indeed remarkable. Ideas like those of Ross are considered by other scholars as results of inadmissible evidence of Psyche scholarship, while also indicate a romantic idealization, a guilt-induced acknowledgement of marginalized cultures, and an excessive fascination with the outsider and the other. A rather active member of the contemporary Celtic spiritual movement is the folk healer of our discussion, Andrew Stead. Born in East Anglia, but of Scottish descent, he has roots from the Highlands clans of Davidson and Tinge, and also absolutely brilliant in what he's doing. Stead became an apprentice of Healing Ways for more than a decade while residing in the United States in the late 20th century. Alongside Lakota, Chippewa, and Blackfoot medicine people, Stead learned the local traditions, while alongside contemporary Celtic shamanistic healer Tom Cowan, he was initiated into Celtic worldviews. However, almost 25 years ago, while leading pilgrimages in the British Isles, he started receiving calls from spirits of his homeland to return and reconnect British people to their lands. Since then, Stead has been weaving the medicine for others, as he puts it, teaching the tales, myths, and wisdom of the pre-Christian Celtic cosmos. He has been leading pilgrimages all over Britain, as well as workshops and year-long apprenticeships, while also publishing books and releasing CDs of his own songs and stories as offered to him by the spirits. I met Stead in November 2015 when he invited me to his 3-day ceremony named Wild Hunt, as inspired by the mythic tale of a soul-ravening night flight to the beyond in the woods of Lafannan, Aberdeenshire. Stead's Wild Hunt celebration had 3 main goals: to sing the souls home, to pick up the bones of the dead, and sweep the woods clean. While most Wild Hunt mythical assignments have been made with mythical figures such as Odin or Hjerne the Hunter, Stead associates it with the Celtic god Lu and the saga of the Second Battle of Moytura, namely the mythic battle between the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann, the first inhabitants of Ireland according to Irish mythology, when the latter rebelled against the former's oppression and prevailed due to the bravery of Lu. The 2015 Wild Hunt ceremony was Stead's 18th in a 10-year span, and its main goal was to connect all participants to their ancestors and their land. Since receiving the call of the Celtic spirits in 1998, Stead has been entirely committed spiritually to his roots. He has been following the green road, as he describes his own spiritual path, influenced by the concept of the red road, the overgeneralized spiritual metaphor used and in some instances culturally appropriated by New Age or neo-pagan communities for the beliefs and teachings of Native American peoples as the right path of life. Stead told me in 2015 that he uses the term green road or spirituality simply as a frame of reference to describe our own, meaning the local Irish and Scottish indigenous pathways whose blueprint is in the stories. His inspiration to follow this path in life also had its origins from Celtic stories. It came and still comes from the word Amran, which he discovered while spiritually connecting to the Second Battle of Moytura. He told me about this connection. If you read the Second Battle of Maitura, there's a word that's written, and I haven't seen it written anywhere else. And they say that before the battle, the smith, the healer, Ogma, who is the poet, the Dagda, and Lu go up on a hill and spend a year and a day working with Amran. And Amran, from my own research, when I found out what it meant, was a time and place for sacred chanting. And then I realized that I've been weaving Amran all my life. It's medicine. I work with the dragon lines. That is the straight lines that are thought of connecting the British sacred sites. It's work that I can weave into the sea and into the land for cleansing. Stit's cosmology is, therefore, almost entirely based on the first Celtic mythological cycle, the set of mythic stories about the lives and deeds of the Tuatha De Danann, a race of godlike people who emigrated to Ireland in 5 different migrating waves and stayed there as their inhabitants until the appearance of mortal men, which caused the retreat into the spiritual world as Sith, fairies. But how does Stid connect with them spiritually? He explains how he uses the techniques he had learned alongside his teachers overseas. The spirit songs, it's not just Andrew sitting down to write a bunch of songs. Spirit came through, Brigid came through, Boan came through, Manan MacLear came through. I was on Iona in a cave, in a tidal cave. And I spent the day questing inside the cave while the sea had retreated. And before it came back in again, Manan MacLear brought this absolutely gorgeous song through me about how he comes twice a day to make love to the bones of the land. He makes love to this beautiful woman, and he writes that his white horses come to greet her. As with everything Celtic, the Irish and Scottish spiritual cosmos is also surrounded by historical uncertainty, factual murkiness, and ongoing scholarly debates. The majority of the stories, for example, about the Irish and Scottish heroes and gods are to be found in fragmented pieces in Lebor Gabala Eren, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, or Book of Invasions, and compilation of prose and poetry scribed by clerics in the 11th century. The book has been regarded by some scholars as an intentional effort by the monks to bridge the chasm between Christian world chronology and the prehistory of Ireland in order to give the local people a mythic history similar to those of Greece or Rome. The fact that all manuscripts on Irish mythology are dated from the late 11th and early 12th centuries up to the late 14th century raises also questions regarding the context, authority, and circumstances under which they were written. Daniel Melia says, what we do know is that they were written by clerics and that Ireland had a long tradition of professional oral transmission of literature and lore. Lastly, the fact that all stories were written down not only centuries later, but also by local Christian monks, might also indicate that these literary accounts could have been products of a struggle where the desire to record the native stories was in conflict with the religious resentment of other than Christian beliefs, Tina Fields adds. Bergholm once again points out that even though these texts are treated by academia with sensitivity towards their historical and linguistic background as well as their contextual settings, contemporary Celtic spiritualists tend to regard them as actual historical evidence for their belief systems. She notes, however, that this tendency can also be found in academia, and especially in recent archaeological findings that have presumably connected the text to a historical past that was preserved and transmitted orally into the early Middle Ages. At the same time, she blames academia for having failed to understand 2 crucial things regarding the contemporary spiritual movements: that the text, ambiguous in its origins, can be recreated in every interpretation, and that the early Irish legends have been one of the most significant sources for the self-identification of these groups. I asked Stid about the issue of Celtic mythology. Stid does acknowledge the historical ambiguity of the Irish sagas. He told me, we do have stories that the monks scribed, and I know that they may have put in some of their own interpretations. I accept all of that. At the same time, he also believes that the core of the stories must have pre-existed before being eventually written down by the Christian monks in order to be passed on to us, aligning to some extent with Fields' belief that these stories might have been products of an inner struggle for the preservation of the past ways and beliefs. What he does find, however, more important regarding the stories is the way of their transmission, both before and after being written down, referring therefore to the long tradition of professional oral transmission of literature and lore in Ireland and Scotland. He told me, you had Sanaki, the Irish and Scottish Gaelic historians and storytellers who were also the bearers of folklore. You had bards, you had storytellers, whatever they were known as. They were the people who went around, and they were the keepers and sharers of the story. Stead elaborated his argument regarding the importance of oral transmission as part of the dynamic and ever-evolving nature of folklore, and the fact that in this process, those stories are being altered each time they are told, as follows. So, of course, shamanism, the magical arts, whatever you want to call what we do, of course, it's going to evolve, because stories are always going to evolve. The story was written down because the moment was never written down, because the moment you write it down, you fix it and has nowhere to go. The storytellers were always in the flow of the story. All this brings us, therefore, to one key question. Does Stead consider that the teaching and practices he offers to be Celtic? Actually, he's quite skeptical. He's totally aware that the term probably suggests a unified ethnic past. In a similar vein, the term Native American has been applied to diverse and different Northern American cultures, which has never been the case. He told me, the other piece that I suppose concerns me is that Celtic becomes a bit of a buzzword. I mean, I use the word Celtic just like people use, I will say, Native American. There's no such thing. So, of course, it's an umbrella. So we can use Celtic because it's an umbrella. It gives us a reference point and an understanding. And now we can work into that piece. But if you had to put a term on yourself, would you have said that you are doing Celtic things? And he responded to me, well, I do use the word. I mean, if you see in my literature, you see the word Celtic because it's a framework. But I always quantify that when I meet people. I think it's important. In the same discussion, Stead also elaborated on his idea on Celtic cultures, adding that in his view, pre-Christian communities on the British Isles were probably locally structured and had different place names, local idioms and traditions. For example, while he was explaining to me how he places elements in his medicine wheel according to the cardinal directions, he pointed out that he believed that in the past people would have probably placed them all differently depending on where they lived and who their localized gods and goddesses were. The use of the term Celtic, however, is used by him regardless of his acknowledgement of its vagueness and overgeneralization. This happens because in contemporary popular views, Britain's and also Brittany's pre-Christian past has been associated to the presence of the Celts. Therefore, whether reclaiming, reviving, inventing, or reconstructing alleged past traditions, healing practitioners like Stead feel the need to particularize their approaches according to popular understandings. Describing their teachings and practices as Celtic provides them with a framework, a much-needed frame of reference, so that people who approach them have an overall idea of what they offer. And what about Celtic shamanism? If we do accept the term Celtic as a required frame of reference for the British and Brittonic pre-Christian traditions, did a Celtic shamanism phenomenon exist? In fact, historical, ethnographic, and archaeological data are even more obscure regarding the existence of shamanistic-like figures in pre-Christian, medieval, or early modern Britain. I would even argue that if Celtic as a term is a glass half full, as the people regarded as Celts did at least reside in the British Isles, Celtic shamanism as a historical phenomenon is definitely a glass half empty. Let's see the data for this. We saw earlier in our discussion that many scholars, among them shamanistic experts Piers Vitebsky and Michael Winkelmann, consider pre-Christian Celtic Britain a possible shamanistic region. It would have been so much easier for my research to take this point of view as granted and answer the third research question: are contemporary healers in Scotland and Ireland part of historically recorded Celtic shamanism that evolved throughout time? Positively. However, the data do not back this idea up. The main issue, as with many other European shamanism, is the lack of recorded historical accounts and archaeological discoveries supporting the idea. There are many reasons why someone like Vitebsky or Winkelmann would argue that pre-Christian Celtic Britain was associated to shamanism. Shamanistic features can be definitely traced in the alleged practices of the Druids. Caesar depicted them as the high order, as philosophers, as judges and tutors, and also as diviners, prophets, and connoisseurs of the natural world, who had their assemblies near groves of trees or in shrines. Of the bards, of the Gelta, the wild madmen in the Irish story of Bulle Hevne, another shamanistic figure, wandering as hermits in the woods and living in the trees. Or the Fili, the poet-seers who possessed supernatural powers. Or in the stories of mythical heroes such as Finn Macul and Taliesin, who were shapeshifters just as the shamans. Or in the lives of Celtic saints. For example, St. Kelvin of Glendalough, an ascetic figure able to enter trance state and communicate with birds. Even after the British Isles converted to Christianity, one could trace shamanistic traits in practices, beliefs, and individuals. For example, we had common belief in the fairy worlds. We also had the belief of the existence, and later execution, of witches who were able to enter fairy worlds and upon their return seemed to possess supernatural abilities. And also some sparse examples of separate cases. For instance, Thomas der Ertildun, known in local legends as Thomas the Rhymer, a 12th century local laird with divination and other supernatural abilities. Michael Scott, the Wizard of the North, a well-traveled and highly respected 13th century scientist who, according to Scottish folklore, had the ability to communicate with magical entities and split hills and vitrify witches with his magical powers. And particularly, Reverend Robert Kirk from Aberfoyle, near Stirling, a seventh son of a seventh son, whose book, The Secret Commonwealth, an 18th century collection of supernatural stories of second sight and detailed descriptions of the fairy kingdom, is considered to have been based on his own personal experiences alongside fairies, while his death, according to local legends, is believed to have been the outcome of an abduction by the fairies, a belief still widespread in the local community of Aberfoyle as late as the 1980s, according to folklorist Margaret Bennett. Nonetheless, these examples can only be considered hypotheses and are potential indicators of British shamanistic traditions. When it comes to the pre-Christian texts and the biographies of the Celtic saints, not only were they literary products of medieval Christian culture, but also portrayed shamanistic abilities and not shamanism. Therefore, they were not, which is very important, appropriately and socioculturally contextualized in space and time. As with the more recent cases, these were non-systematic. For example, Druids or Gelta or the Fili did not exist anymore in order to pass on their knowledge. They were situated in a very different religious and social context. The belief in fairies was considered in this context as credulous. They were secretive, as the alleged witches practiced in private and not for a community as shamans do, while people like Scott or Kirk belonged to other socially accepted by European standards professional classes. As anthropologist Thomas Dubois correctly points out, these hypotheses are mostly outcomes of our current ability to access ethnographic research on historically and ethnographically recorded shamanisms, leading to the concept's application to other contexts, and also to an increasing interest in uncovering and documenting as many unique past religions as possible, even ones buried in the remote past and reflected by cryptic or misleading ancient texts, as with the case of the Celtic spiritual past. Returning therefore to Steed, what does he think about Celtic shamanism? In fact, he approaches the term shaman with the same skepticism as with Celtic traditions. He told me in our discussion in December 2015, I know some shamans in the world, and I have never ever heard them call themselves a shaman. They never stood up and said, I'm a shaman. They get on with their work. And so it's labels. I don't really buy on labels. Yeah, Andrew Steed, he's the druid. Andrew Steed, oh yeah, he's a shaman. A lot of people would say, Andrew Steed, oh yeah, he's a wizard. And actually, if you ask me which term I'm actually comfortable with, and it's tongue-in-cheek, I would say I'm a wizard. And I laugh at that, Sakis, because I remember when I was 18 standing in my hometown, and this young woman said to me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, a wizard. And I suppose in many ways that's what I've grown into. Or once little child in Glastonbury said, look, mommy, there's a man witch. And in the old days, I would probably be called a witch or a wizard. Actually, it makes sense that Steed feels more comfortable with the terms he mentions in the conversation. The names have been the ones historically associated to the European traditions of people involved in magical arts and folk healing, shamanism, which is something that Steed also believes, whether these people have been called carlins, witches, wizards, witch doctors, elders, or magicians. The same happened with the other two healers of the research. Mace eventually started describing himself as a psychomagician, while Duncan a monk. Not only do these people feel more familiar culturally with these terms, but also acknowledge the shamanism as a local phenomenon belonged and still belongs in other than Western cultures with historically and ethnographically recorded shamanistic practices and beliefs. However, do they respond to the name shaman? They all do. And once again, this has to do with their connections with others. Steed, for example, told me, if the community call you shaman, that is up to the community. So there will be people on the planet who would call me a shaman. That's their prerogative. You will never hear me calling myself a shaman. I will tell you I'm a shamanic practitioner and I work with shamanism on a daily basis. Therefore, as with the term Celtic, Steed once again believes that the use of any term related to shamanism, whether it's shaman, shamanic practitioner, or anything else similar, provides the people he connects with a framework to understand his work. Therefore, to wrap up, in my opinion, the paper wanted to showcase that in reality we might be dealing with two entirely different concepts. On the one hand, that of Celtic shamanism as a possible historical phenomenon in Ireland and Scotland, and on the other hand, that of the contemporary Celtic shaman. The former seems to be an over-romanticized, murky concept, as the term Celtic overgeneralizes and probably simplifies distinct local practices across Britain, while shamanism among the Celts is a concept that has been based on rather weak and uncontextualized historical and archaeological data. The latter, however, is a contemporary inclusive concept which is based on already established popular perceptions that help people by providing them with a much-needed frame of understanding of the syncretic things practitioners like Steed offer. They are shamans, therefore the healing practices in question revolve around imported from elsewhere shamanistic values and techniques, and they are Celtic because they connect, or in the case of British people, reconnect others with what are considered to be in popular mind the Celtic lands and traditions. This contemporary concept can eventually also become a basis for the practitioners and the people they connect with upon which to build anew, as well as a new and illustrious context that serves as a source of pride and identity. And who knows, maybe in 2324, in a similar lecture setting, there will be someone discussing about the first wave of 21st century shamans who were the trailblazers for the emergence of the historically recorded Scottish and or Irish shamanism that has survived for almost 350 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting. We're so appreciative of you taking the time to go through all that. That was brilliant. You'll see, everyone, that Robin's posted a message in the chat there, just so you can see where you're supposed to post your questions. So if you've got anything you'd like to ask, we've still got 15 minutes. So if you've got anything you want to ask or anything that you're more interested in, then please just post your questions there. Robin's actually posted one to kick off there. Someone's put in clapping hands, so obviously has very much enjoyed that presentation. So Robin says, how do you feel about it's all good. So how do you feel about the idea that modern attempts to document and define the term Celtic shamanism could impact the nature of the practice or practices, since its previously nuanced and evolving nature comes from an oral tradition?
To be honest, I don't think it matters at all. It's, as I told you, it's a matter of self-identification, of self-identity, and how they all approach these are all important terms, but in this globalized, modern, contemporary, post-industrialized context, traditions in folklore, we say travel. So shamanism travels. Celtic, the issue with Celtic, as I wanted to point out, is that maybe they were Celts, or they belong to the umbrella term of Celtic cultures, but probably they were not so unified. So I think that when we both academia and also the practitioners and the communities, the pagan communities or spiritual communities, use the term Celtic, they mostly refer to the past traditions of the British Islands. I don't think it matters that much which are these traditions. What matters most, and I have it in my presentation, but I didn't have time in order to say it, is that they reclaim these past traditions. There is this need for people to actually connect to their ancestral roots, the pre-Christian ancestral roots. There are many reasons why somebody, for example, from Britain, wants to reconnect to pre-Christian Britain. It's, for example, an isolation or alienation to modern medicine that is very unpersonal, and also it's an isolation or alienation better from the church as a dogma and also as an institution. So all those things in your quest in order to find your own spirituality might lead you back to past traditions. Of course, we're talking about past traditions that were orally transmitted and were written down way after by Christian monks. So were they altered? Probably they were. But they still belong in a geographical region, and that this is what what matters, because people actually reclaim it. Whether it's not false, whether it has been altered, but this is how traditions work. They evolve and they ever change.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We're getting more and more clapping emojis in the chat there. Thanks. So obviously people have really enjoyed it. Okay, so the next question says, in my opinion, the modern way of documenting and offering online modules instead of traditional training of Eastern spirituality has resulted in a loss of the sacredness of the practice. So that's more of a comment.
We're talking about Eastern spirituality.
It says Eastern spirituality, yeah.
Just Eastern spirituality. Well, it's an issue. I don't know if we're talking about cultural appropriation now. If we are talking about no.
It says no.
Okay.
Okay. So it's just reflecting a similarity.
So it's a statement. Yeah, probably. To be honest, as a folklorist, I focused more on the British side of things, because as folklorists we see the region and the places that we we reside. So I'm not quite familiar with Eastern spiritualities. Obviously, I read about it, but I didn't travel abroad in order to compare it. But I suppose, all kinds of spiritualities have gone through the process of changing, of sacredness changing, or whatever. It's an evolution.
Yeah. And this person also said, yes, and everyone is selling something in the West. It affects the sacredness.
Okay.
So
that's another question.
We've got another question just come in. So it says, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. So could we say that practitioners are aware of the problematics that arise from them using the term Celtic shamanism, but they keep using it because it relates them to a specific group or community of contemporary spiritual healers?
They keep using it because there are two terms that are known to the people they connect with. So it gives their communities, their patients, the clients, an understanding of what they are doing. They could be called folk healers, but folk healers I'm using the word folk healers, but it's an umbrella term. I think these people they accept the use of the term shaman for their practices because they use some specific techniques that are imported from elsewhere because they were trained in these techniques and they imported to the British context. So because they reach ecstasy and they are healers and they talk to the spiritual world and they do this by ritual, they have shamanistic knowledge. So if somebody calls them a shaman, they accept it as a term, but then they quantify it. They particularize it. Yes, I accept the term shaman. I'm doing shamanistic things, but I want to explain what exactly I am doing. When it comes to Celtic, as I told you earlier, Celtic refers as it's not all practitioners that I've worked with that are doing Celtic practices, but the ones that want to reconnect people back to the pre-Christian traditions, they do use the term Celtic as a framework, as a frame of reference. Yes. I don't know if...
That's great. No, that's super. Thank you so much for that. We don't have any more questions at the moment. I don't want to cut off too soon, just in case people are still typing. While we're waiting, I was just going to ask, Andrew sounds like such an interesting person to, sit and have a conversation with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any sort of fond or standout memories you have from some of your conversations with him?
Well, actually, we had one conversation. Well, I was more than 2 hours. Most of my memories come from rituals, from the rituals I participated. So my research was mainly we use the term in ethnography based on the participative observation. So I was both participating and I was observing. But by the end of my involvement in my research, to be honest, I became more of a participant and less than an observer. Not because I had already made my conclusions regarding my research, but because I became more involved into these practices. One thing that I didn't mention, and it's the first thing I wrote on my thesis, is that I'm not a shamanic practitioner myself. I'm not a pagan practitioner myself. I have a total different social and spiritual background. And that was one thing that I told them. They respected it, and I respected them. And they wanted me to understand their practices, their teachings, and their works by participating. So I gave it back as part of the research reciprocity. The mutuality that have research and the subject of the research, that I give my participation, I give my honesty and my sincerity of who I am, and they give me their inner knowledge of what they're doing and everything. Very interesting conversations, but mostly very interesting rituals.
Definitely. It sounds amazing. We've got one last question just come in there. It says, what about Terry Mace and Norman Duncan? What was your experience of him?
Well, Terry Mace calls himself a psychomagician. So he was trained in local healing traditions of the Aboriginal while he was working there as a dairy farmer. And also he was trained by Maori healers in New Zealand, as he was also working there as a farmer for 4 years. And then he combined it, so we're talking about syncretic practices. So he combined it with his own professional and educational background in philosophy and transactional analysis. And also Alejandro Jodorowsky's, who's a well-known spiritualist and also director from Chile, approach of psycho-shamanism. And he was doing this as a community healer, actually, in Callan. He also ran his own shop up in Callan. But because he was, I'm gonna say it, a bit naive regarding capitalistic societies, he was asking for donations and not fees. So he became bankrupt, and then this led to multiple health issues, and now he's living as a hermit somewhere near Banff. Norman, on the other hand, a very long spiritual journey as a monk. He was trained in Aikido. He was trained in Rinzai Buddhism. He then he was educated in psychotherapy, and then he was trained by curanderos, by Peruvian and Chilean curanderos in ayahuasca. And then he made his own approach called Norwen shamanism, and now he's actually located in Aberdeen. He came back to Aberdeen after 40 years of wandering around in Europe in order to take care of his ill parents that now have passed away because of spirits, calls from the spirits. He called his approach No Way, so it's an integration of all these practices together. So there are syncretic practices. Terry Mace calls himself, or used to call himself, psychomagician. Now he's a hermit. I haven't talked to him for a while. I have spoken to Norman nowadays, and he's quite active, actually, trying to relocate himself in order to be closer to his communities in England. And he offers syncretic, shamanistic folk healing practices that combine psychotherapy that Western people understand, and also shamanistic techniques and ideas about nature and the cycle of life and all those kinds of things.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for that. I think that's it for questions. We've had anything else come in, so it just leaves now for me to say thank you so much again for.
No worries at all. It was my pleasure.
Say that again.
My greetings. It was my pleasure.
Ah,
I miss Aberdeen. I'm going to visit you in August after 4 years that I've been away.
You're going to visit? Brilliant.
Yeah, I'm going to visit. Yeah, I'm going to visit.
But you'll have to come to the alumni office and see.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to visit you. Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this.
And let me say to everyone who's joined us, thank you so much for giving your time this afternoon. And I hope that you're able to enjoy some more sunshine wherever you are. I think we were all lucky enough to have some sunshine today. So I hope you get to go and enjoy more of that. And we'll hopefully see you another time. Thank you so much.